And my co-chair, Yehuda Carmeli from Israel, will present what went wrong in controlling Carbapenemases, experiences from country with endemic KPC. He will tell you everything about how to control, not only to describe, but to control Carbapenemases.
So I was asked actually to speak on what went wrong with the control of carbapenemases. So I will start with that usually we show these slides and describe our success, because what you can see here is that in the beginning of 2006, that's a nationwide data in the beginning of 2006 until the mid-2007, we had the logarithmic increase in KPCs, and then we took national measures of using dedicated staff, cohorting of patients, and a task force that supervised the national compliance with that and helped with advice and monitoring. And later on, we also introduced some screening guidelines, and we were very successful in containing the outbreak. But if you look very carefully, you see that we actually did not eradicate it. And this part is primarily due to reservoir that has been created primarily in long-term care facilities. But I think that the organizers of the meeting were quite smart to ask us not to speak about our success, but about our failures. So I think that's a good idea. So I'm sorry. The first thing, the failure is here, as you can see. We had this huge outbreak, so it's very evident. I will not go about determinants of carbapenems at will. The only thing that I will mention that Tim mentioned just briefly is that you can get actually carbapenem-resistant phenotype not by carbapenemases, but a combination of ESBL and heparin mutants. And actually, when you have a place where ESBLs are endemic, like Israel, then many of the organisms that you see may be then carbapenem resistant just by virtue that about 2 to 5% of the Klebsiellas that are ESBL producers have also a heparin mutation that leads at least to increased MICs to the carbapenems and sometimes frank resistance, primarily to ertapenem. In 2004, we did a national study in the 10 largest Israeli hospitals. So that covers, about 70 or 80% of all the acute hospital beds in Israel. And we actually did not detect even a single carbapenemase. So we can quite confidently say that carbapenemases were at least extremely rare if existing in Israel in 2004. And that's for the American connection. But I will go now from national data to speak about my own hospital in Tel Aviv, because we have very detailed data on this specific hospital. We have been collected all carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae, or almost all of them, from the early 2000s. And actually, we have seen from time to time carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae, but those were primarily belong to the Proteus family. And many of them were actually susceptible to other classes of beta-lactamases, and that's a false positive resistance to the carbapenems. We actually tested about 40 of these isolate, retested, and actually showed on an agar-based method that that's a false positive resistant. Why is that important? Because you truly, and that's a major problem, because if your technicians in the lab are used to see carbapenem resistance in Enterobacteriaceae, and they know that time after time you tell them, oh, that's a false positive result, when you would have a carbapenemase, they may also discard it and not pay enough attention to it. So I think you have to have on place protocols on how to confirm every isolate and make sure it's truly not a carbapenemase. At the beginning of 2004, we had actually a first case of carbapenemase, which was a KPC2 that we have not detected. We collected the isolate, but it was a urine isolate. Patient discharged. The result came back after the patient was outside of the hospital. No one was notified. As part of our routine isolate collection of carbapenem-resistant strain, we collected the strain, so it was in our collection, but we haven't done anything about it. But then in June 2004, we had an outbreak in our NICU. There were 3 cases of late neonatal sepsis and 3 other patients. When we did full screening of the entire NICU, we found another 3 neonates that were colonized. We actually traced, and we did a thorough investigation, and the only thing we actually found was that a mother of a triplet that were affected was a GI carrier of the strain. She was not she did not have foreign travel to the U.S., and she did not have any medical treatment in other countries. You can see the pulse field gel electrophoresis. They were all very similar. The mother of the children had a little bit different strain. And actually, when we looked and found this isolate from January, again, Enterobacter, you'd see that he had also the same pulse field gel electrophoresis pattern. Those were identified then as the first time in our hospital as a KPC producers, and you can see that the mother had another beta-lactamase in this strain that the others did not have, and that's why we assume, which may not be correct, that the mother was the source of the organisms. So there were no additional cases in the hospital for the next 6 months, and our interpretation was that the mother of the triplet was the carrier of the strain, was transferred to her babies and spread by healthcare workers in the NICU. But again, other options also exist. And then as I said, there were no other cases during the same year, but the following 2 years, we actually had 30 new cases with very few small outbreaks, and mostly those cases were sporadic cases. There was, they belonged primarily to 2 clones. There were 3 clones, but primarily 2 clones. And repeated investigation over time did not identify a common source or the source of these. So that's the story of Enterobacter KPC2, just to remind you. And now we go to E. coli. In 2005, we had 4 isolates of E. coli that were KPC2 producing. And each of them had a different, I'll show you that. 2 of these cases were on the first or second day of hospital admission. And they had various sources, no contact between the patients. So it remained, in terms of epidemiology, a mystery. And you can see, again, they had 4 different pulse field gel electrophoresis types, so they were different from each other. 4 different plasmid patterns, the same enzyme, but the plasmid patterns had similar bands between the plasmids, so they had a common backbone. We identified that there is a problem, that we are facing a risk, and our infection control committee in the hospital twice brought the issue to the attention also of the management and for discussion. And we discussed the fact that it's sporadic events, we don't understand them, that we don't know where it's coming. We have every patient that we identified was put in a single patient room when possible. I want to make that clear, because in some occasions where patients needed a step-down unit or so, they could have been with other patients in the same room. They were placed on contact isolation, and they were marked for readmission to be isolated again. We presented it twice to the hospital management. We said that we have issues and questions regarding our ability to identify those isolates, because at that time it became clear that the Vitek 2 system was not sensitive enough to detect all these strains. And we thought that we need to start and develop molecular method and start screening patients. At that time, truly, at the end, the decision was, it's a small problem. It doesn't seem to be transmitted in the hospital, so we won't do much about it. And I just want to show the difficulties with diagnosing those strains. It's inoculum dependent and different. And if you see, there were reports on the failure of automated system to detect some of these strains. So what went wrong? Well, first, we did not notify the nosocomial branch of the Ministry of Health of this event and to alert other hospitals of the possibility. And I'm sorry to say, but the reason we haven't done it because our Ministry of Health at that time did not have a nosocomial branch. Then we did not improve our detection and screening methods. And because it was felt, or it's actually our failure to convince our management that that was a priority, that resources should have been allocated to improve the screening method. Although, as I've shown you, some of the cases were clearly coming outside of the hospital, we did not initiate an investigation outside of the hospital to find possible reservoirs, and I think that was a failure. And we also did not establish a 100% secure notification system between the lab and the infection control. We still were dependent on the technician noticing and letting us know we have some strange organism or phenotype, and those things may fail from time to time. And we did not have a long-term plan. At the end of 2005, we saw the first time the Klebsiella that is resistant to everything susceptible to gentamicin only. And it was identified as a KPC3 later on, but I will go over the details. So what you see here is analysis of our Klebsiella isolates from some time. You can see in 2004, we had KPC, various clones, a combination of ESBL and a porin mutant, so no carbapenemase. In the beginning of 2005, we started seeing a KPC2 in Klebsiella, and at that point, we do a thorough evaluation. We say we have multiple clones, we have KPC2, we don't find a common source in the hospital, we truly don't know what to do. But what we haven't noticed that in this phase, we actually start to see KPC3, and that is actually clonal. And what happens here, you see a clonal outbreak increasing, and what, retrospectively looking at this data, we have two different outbreaks. We have a KPC2 outbreak, which is relatively sporadic, various clones, and until today, we don't figure out completely how it's progressing. And the KPC3, which is a monoclonal and highly epidemic strain. And that's just to put it in perspective, what happened to our Enterobacter, E. coli, and Klebsiella. And you can see that the E. coli and Enterobacter remained as really minor events, really sporadic events, but the Klebsiella took off as a major epidemic. And when we look at that, you can see what happened between 2005 and 2007. In 2005, 2006, you see multiple clones and then some monoclonal or dominant clone. And in 2007, there is actually 95% of the isolates belong to the epidemic clone. So it's, in my interpretation, there are two different outbreaks going on. There are high mortality associated with these infections, and with bacteremia, there are reports of greater than 70% mortality with these organisms. And at the beginning of 2007, we started speaking to our colleagues, and different colleagues said, well, we have the same problem, and we realized, and we asked all the infection control society has asked different people from different hospitals to come for a meeting and present their epidemic curve. And what you see here is 2 hospitals, but actually you could see almost all Israeli hospitals, and definitely all large hospitals, had exactly the same epidemic curve, which showed that at the beginning of 2006 or late 2005, and logarithmically increasing outbreak, which was not noticed as a national problem until February of 2007. And when we look at the strain, again, it's 8 hospitals, 5 long-term care facilities, the same clone, and actually it's a clone similar to the same isolates that were implicated for New Jersey and Arizona outbreaks and New York outbreaks in the early 2000s. So we approached the Ministry of Health to intervene. Guidelines were written by the Infection Control Society in Israel and embraced by the Ministry of Health on isolation, cohorting with dedicated staff and dedicated equipment, reporting daily on cases and isolation status, and national task force that was started as a form of nosocomial branch of the Ministry of Health to control this outbreak. And these are data from my hospital from the day we implemented dedicated staffing with cohorting. Within 2 weeks, the outbreak really subsided. We continue to see cases because there are more and more importations for mostly our own readmissions, but partly new cases from long-term care facilities or other hospitals. And I've shown you that actually there was a success here So I want to tell you about one outbreak that I think is very informative because as I've shown you here, we succeeded very nicely. And the first month that we had 0 new cases, new clinical cases, I think was January or February of 2008. And we were very proud of that, and then we had this event. A patient was admitted and recently was hospitalized elsewhere. A day later, a urine culture is taken. Then a day later reported to have maybe a carbapenem-resistant strain, but required further testing. They were not sure. So the patient is isolated in a single patient room, but with no dedicated staff and not cohorting because we don't know yet. We don't want to put him with other positive patients. So there are technical problems. The test needs to be repeated. Then there is a weekend. Then a week later, a carbapenem resistant is confirmed. The patient is cohorted. We do screening culture for 10 patients that we felt were in contact with him, and all of them were negative. That seems not bad, but then we start seeing new cases in patients who were in contact with him, a patient with pneumonia who died then later, then other patients who were in contact. And when you go, you could see that over time, I would not go over all the details, that's the investigation actually showing, that's the timeline, and that's when a patient becomes positive. The color means the ward, and this sign means the patient moved to a cohorting. And you can see a large outbreak in one ward, then moving to another ward, and 4 wards. And when we summarize that, we have more than 30 cases in 4 wards, and it took us, I think, 2.5 months to overcome this outbreak. So at that point, we understood that you have to really screen and rescreen and screen on admission patients at high risk. And based on our findings, we actually worked with different groups to have recommendations of what needs to be done. And I would say the 2 main papers that I think summarize that very nicely is a paper that was published in CMI and represents the European Society of Clinical Microbiology and Infectious Diseases, and a patient that was published later in the Eurosurveillance, directed more to microbiologists by the EARS net group. So we looked at areas and divided them into low-level areas and medium to high-level areas. And we said your aims should be different. In a low-level area, you need to have a strict eradication policy, a search and destroy policy. And in medium-high level area, you have to have a very active containing policy with zero tolerance for newly hospital-acquired strains. You are unlikely to get to real zero cases, in the short run at least, but you have to try and get to zero new cases in the hospital. And in the microbiology in low prevalence area or no cases, we said that every laboratory should screen all Enterobacteriaceae for Carbapenemases, one way or another, and have an action plan ready for detection. So for microbiological confirmation, if you find one, for screening contacts, for epidemiological investigation, and for eradication. So the plan should not be started only after you detect them, but have those plans ready. And everything should be coordinated and supervised in a regional, national, or even more level. And with first detection, have active search and destroy policy. It's much easier to invest a lot of work and much less costly to invest a lot of effort when you have one case. Although sometimes it seems, well, for one case we'll do so much. You should do it because otherwise you'll pay much more. And what we also suggested is define high-risk patient groups or countries, screen all high-risk patients, and screening sites should be rectal swabs or stools. And preemptive isolation is recommended while awaiting results of screening. I think that I will, at this point, finish my presentation, and if there is time, I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Yehuda. So it's possible to contain Carbapenemase producing bugs, clearly. Question for Yehuda, if I may begin with one. Back to your outbreaks where the first case was quite difficult to identify. Apparently, the transfer of patients from ward to ward, basically was the root of part root of the epidemics. We advocate at the very beginning of an event, after a single case, not to transfer anyone from the involved ward to another one. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's very smart when you have very few cases or no cases. For the first case, it's definitely required. We live in a situation where we screen on a daily basis. We do, in my hospital, about 1,000 screens per month. We have about 1% positivity, so on screening, so we have about 10 new cases detected a month by screening on admission. So that is very difficult to, what we do now, we actually have, in my hospital, we have a system that automatic, a computer system that tracks everyone who was in contact with a patient wherever he went to any and he's spotted. His swabs are taken and he's put in contact isolation until results are back.
Quite good. Yes, next question, please.
This was going to be my question about isolation policy for high-risk patients. You isolate them until you get the screening culture.
Yeah, again, if you're able to do it, I will highly recommend of doing it. If you're having such, we cannot isolate everyone who comes from long-term care facility because that's too much, and that's our high-risk population. High risk with 2% positivity or 3% positivity. But we cannot isolate them preemptively all. So only if someone was in contact, and we know that someone was in contact has about 10% chance of being positive.
But you would recommend it for the countries where the story is only at the very beginning?
Definitely. I would say that you should be the stricter that you can if you have your first case, because that will pay off.
We have still
Eitan.
2 minutes.
McAllen, Atlanta. Wonderful talk. Do you, in your guidelines or in the European guidelines, specify a maximum turnaround time for the laboratory to provide you with the information from the testing?
No, and the reason we don't do that is that we don't believe that every microbiology laboratory in countries where you don't have endemic situation are able to truly identify carbapenemases versus non-carbapenemases. So our recommendation is that once you have a sign that it may be a carbapenemases, start isolating, and then start moving the wheel of making sure it's not spread. But send it and have a reference laboratory that can confirm it in the right time. I can tell you that in my hospital, in order to shorten the turnaround time, what we have done, we implement for everything that is suspected as positive, we do a PCR. So we will get all the results in 24 hours or less.
And that's your standard in your institute?
Exactly. Well, not in all, but I would say that 24 to 48 hours is acceptable. More than that is not acceptable.
Great talk. Is there evidence that the multi-TOF system will get us the information much faster, that not only identification of the pathogen, but also the resistance pattern?
I don't know that that is correct, but I think that the multi-TOF has a potential because the multi-TOF can actually, theoretically at least, do typing of the organisms. And since in our situation, it's mostly one clone, you might be able to identify the clone and say immediately. That will miss probably the KPC2 that are multi-clonal, but that's, that's not terrible if you do then a confirmatory other confirmatory test.
But the multi-TOF
Exactly.
You mentioned the issue of long-term care, but I would like to have more information on which did you recommend for patient discharged from hospital going to long-term care facilities and for long-term facilities at all.
How much time do I have? No, truly it's a whole lecture, but I can, if you tell me how much time I have, I will summarize my question.
In 1 minute?
1 minute, okay.
Because there is a question to come by Nagwa Hamis.
So I can say that we intervene in long-term care facilities. Our initial point prevalence study that included more than 1,000 patients in long-term care facilities, we found a point prevalence of 12.5% of carriage. We did some analysis of what would be the risk factors in terms of the behavior of isolation and cohorting and so on. And what our recommendation after that is that patients should be cohorted in the same room, but not with dedicated staff, but patients should be screened on admission to know who's positive and who's negative. And that will be correct for our system. I know that it's correct. After 1.5 years or so, the point prevalence decreased from 12.5% to 8%. We also did other measures in the long-term care facilities to improve hand hygiene and other things, so I'm not sure what was working, but we are planning to do a follow-up study this year, so I hope we'll know better.
Thank you. Last question by Professor Hamis from Egypt.
Yeah. You clarified well the problem of control for those patients. So what about the management? How to treat them? Because we are always faced with this question whenever we have this type of organisms, and especially if you are in a hospital with endemic carbapenem resistant organisms.
So I would say that, in my opinion, there is truly no good treatment. You can choose from colistin to other gentamicin or other agents that appear to be susceptible, but in my opinion, you should do that. You should treat the patient, but I would say that I think that all agents that we have are really inferior in terms of effectiveness.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.